instalment of New South Wales Farmers 30 by 30 webinar series. Tonight, we're really fortunate to have the Honourable Matt Kean, the New South Wales Minister for Energy and the Environment, and the member for Hornsby, joining us for tonight's webinar. My name's Pete Arkle and I'm CEO of New South Wales Farmers. And I'd firstly like to acknowledge the traditional owners, both past and present, of the land on which we meet. I'm joining from Gadigal land here in northern Sydney, but I note we've got 268 registrants from across New South Wales and beyond. 1 in 10 of New South Wales's merchandise exports come from New South Wales farms, 1 in $10. And there are great opportunities to grow our food and fibre industries. New South Wales Farmers has set an aspiration of growing our sector to $30 billion by 2030. To achieve this growth, farmers will require a predictable regulatory environment that gives them the confidence to invest to grow the productivity of their enterprises. They will need to be confident they will be supported to balance productivity and conservation outcomes on their farms. And they will also need reassurance that as New South Wales undergoes an energy transition, developments will be carefully designed to coexist, not conflict, with New South Wales's prime agricultural industries. As I've mentioned, we're really pleased to welcome the Honourable Matt Kean this evening. Matt's campaigned for greater action on climate change, arguing it's not only good for the environment, but also good for our economy. He's taken a keen interest in New South Wales farmers' issues, from pests and weeds to public land management and ensuring balance within our land management and biodiversity conservation framework. To facilitate our discussion this evening, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to our moderator for the night, Mike Foley, who is climate and energy correspondent for the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. Mike's got a impressive pedigree in agricultural journalism, so I'm sure he'll do a great job in directing the questions tonight. We'll open the webinar with an address from Minister Kean, to be followed by a question and answer session to be moderated by Mike. As I've mentioned, we've had an overwhelming response to tonight's webinar, so thank you for joining and thank you to all those who've submitted questions. We've tried to group the questions into some themes and we'll do our best to get through as many as we can. So thank you once again for joining us, and I'd now like to hand over to Minister Kean to provide some opening remarks. Welcome, Minister.
Well, thank you very much, Pete. And can I too begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we gather and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Could I acknowledge you, Pete, in the work you do as CEO of New South Wales Farmers? I deal with a lot of stakeholders, but there are certainly none I trust more or none I work with better than you, Pete. And I want to thank you for investing in that relationship for the good of your stakeholders. It is one I value greatly. Could I also acknowledge the President of New South Wales Farmers, James Jackson, also a great friend and a great confidant when it comes to developing good environmental policy and good industry policy to the benefit of farmers across New South Wales. Could I thank the New South Wales Farmers for inviting me to address this 30 by 30 webinar. You want agriculture to become a $30 billion industry by 2030, and so do I. This is a time of incredible opportunities for agriculture across the nation. With global capital and commodity markets increasingly focused on sustainability, there is a massive opportunity for producers who can meet those benchmarks to outperform either through enhanced market access or by realising a premium on price for their products. This will help to diversify income and to help make farmers more resilient to future shocks. I want New South Wales farmers to be the winners from this changing market dynamic. We've proven that it's possible for healthy environments and productive farms to go hand in hand. Farmers are indispensable partners in the Biodiversity Conservation Trust. More than $350 million is committed to the Biodiversity Conservation Trust for private land conservation over the next 5 years. Around 2/3 of the Biodiversity Conservation Trust's investment in funded conservation agreements is flowing to graziers, farmers, or mixed farming enterprises. It's a proven model that demonstrates that conservation and farming can be partners to deliver secure income for farmers and secure real outcomes for the environment. One thing I think that we'll all be hearing more about in the near future is natural capital. Right now, investors across the world are massively interested in investing in transitioning to a net zero emissions economy and in natural capital, in the natural assets and ecosystems that make human life possible. There is a great opportunity to get more capital invested outside the cities. But I also want to make sure that farmers have a voice in how those funds are invested and ensure that the barriers to entry are low and the rules are easy to navigate. I want New South Wales to be at the forefront of the push to value natural capital. And my department is currently exploring opportunities to develop that further. Your input as farmers in New South Wales is going to be critically important to help us develop the rules around environmental markets and how we develop market-based solutions to environmental issues, and how we can make sure that farmers and the environment are both winners. Now, there is no doubt that we need to rapidly increase the use of new technologies across the board if we're going to succeed in decarbonising in New South Wales. That's why the government asked the Office of the New South Wales Chief Scientist and Engineer to set up a Decarbonisation Innovation Hub as part of the Net Zero Industry and Innovation Program. The hub will support researchers, industry, and government stakeholders to work together to increase the uptake of new technologies. Land and primary industries will be one of the 3 areas of focus. This is a very practical way to make sure that we get the best technology deployed in the best places, and that new technology is commercialised where possible, so that we are the first to market and the first to profit from new decarbonisation technologies and services. In 2015, New South Wales farmers put climate change on the annual conference agenda and voted in policy acknowledging the changing climate conditions and increased climate variability, plus the need to continue pursuing emissions reduction contributions within agriculture. In doing so, you changed the conversation and became a powerful voice to ensure that farmers are the winners from the coming transformation of our economy. The government wants to work with you to make sure we reach 30 by 30 and beyond, to create a prosperous future for farmers and a sustainable future for all of us. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you, Minister. I think I could just jump in and let's get straight into questions, if that's okay. And it's really interesting hearing you map out sort of the comprehensive suite of policies that are going to be required to drive this economic transition that we're seeing flow through from the energy transition. And in regards to that, let's talk about the energy transition first, because I think, well, I know landholders have been at the forefront of experiencing the tangible impacts of that transition in terms of managing land use and competing land use there. Could you run us through sort of the past and the future? So in terms of the past, what consultation has taken place in terms of managing competing interests of agricultural land and renewable energy zones? So what's happened there already? And then tell us what your plans are for the future, because, you know, with New South Wales, you know, you've been quite bold in setting a net zero target. There's going to be a lot more renewable energy required. So, yeah, if you just, you know, focus on how farmers' input, as you mentioned, will play into that decarbonisation push.
Well, Mike, before I do that, if I could just take everyone back a step and help them understand what we're trying to achieve in New South Wales. The reality is that in the next 15 years, 4 of our 5 coal-fired power stations will come to the end of their technical lives. It's got nothing to do with climate change. These are old pieces of equipment, and you know, like all old bits of machinery, they have a finite life. We need to make sure that before those existing forms of traditional forms of dispatchable generation come to the end of their lives, that they're replaced with like-for-like dispatchable generation. Now, today, the cheapest way to replace our existing forms of generation is with newer technologies. And, you know, that's a combination of things. It's a bit of wind, it's a bit of solar, it's a bit of pumped hydro, battery storage, we know is coming down the cost curve dramatically. And AEMO, the independent market operator that you know, is comprised of the engineers that run our electricity system, they've looked at what the New South Wales electricity needs are, and they've designed a plan to ensure that we can replace our existing aging infrastructure with new infrastructure that will drive down prices, keep the lights on, and set us up for that new world that we know is coming very quickly, that low carbon economy. To that end, their integrated system plan, the ISP as it's called, designated 5 renewable energy zones. We've given effect to that in our electricity infrastructure roadmap. And the renewable energy zones will be the equivalent of a modern day power station. It will be a combination of new forms of generation, renewables, plus a bit of battery storage, pumped hydro. We've got a bit of gas in the mix and things like that to ensure that we have that orderly transition. Now, the majority of that infrastructure is going to be built in the regions. So we need to make sure that it's built in areas where there's a social license and that we maintain that social license. And that includes ensuring that it doesn't destroy prime agricultural land or destroy the amenity of local communities. That's why we've built into the planning process that we've approved as part of the roadmap a mechanism to ensure that projects that have that social license, that are wanted by communities, that meet the standards around amenity and character of the area, are the ones that proceed, and will have the ability to remove those ones that don't meet those criteria. So we've got a robust system that we've legislated to ensure that the community has input as to where these things go, the scale at which they'll go, and the timetable which they'll be delivered. That's built into our system.
How within that community consultation, how does landholder, the actual asset owner, factor into the broader community input there? So what mechanisms are there for the wishes of the landholder to host solar development factoring?
So, Mike, strategic planning will be a core objective of the Renewable Energy Program. And as I said, our legislation has mechanisms to ensure that social licence and community support for the RESs is maintained. So in the competitive tender processes that will run for generation projects to participate in the RESs, it will consider community engagement, land use compatibility, and complementary and regional economic benefits as key criteria to determine whether a project goes ahead. So there is a formal way the community can have their input, which will go into determining whether or not a project is able to proceed. So this will encourage the projects to meet best practice community engagement standards and design their projects in a way that works for local communities and minimises potential land use conflicts.
Okay, and we're casting a bit ahead of ourselves here, but I think it is relevant to talk about decommissioning of these assets as well. For example, Federal Parliament today was debating a bill for decommissioning in the oil and gas platforms off the North West Shelf in WA, and some of them are 20 years old or less, and they're at the end of their life. How do you, so sort of a big picture question and then a more tangible question, Matt. How big a scale of a decommissioning task do you think there'll be when those 5 renewable zones identified by AEMO come to the end of their life cycle? How big is that? We're talking billions of dollars there, I guess. And more tangibly, how will that be managed, and how will the taxpayer and the landholder be protected in that process?
Well, the decommissioning of energy infrastructure is not a small task. If you look at a coal-fired power station, you've got the coal ash dams and the huge impact that has on the environment and communities. The decommissioning of these things costs billions and billions of dollars, and in some cases they'll never be fully remediated. As I said, we've put in place mechanisms within the planning and approval framework to ensure that we manage these things over the whole of life, which ensures that it's not the community left to foot the bill. The developer and those that will benefit from these assets will also have to take responsibility for cleaning them up. So, as I said, we've got a legislated mechanism to ensure that that communities engaged, that developers take responsibility not only for the installation but also the cleanup. And we're committed to getting this right because we want to maintain the social license from these projects. And I just seen a couple of questions jumping up on my screen. One of the questions was, but these solar farms are actually currently being built on prime agricultural land. Well, this is because up until now, we haven't had a clear planning pathway for these things to be delivered. They've just been popping up all over the place based on developer interest. What we've tried to do now is have a clear, coordinated planning pathway that ensures that these projects are going where the social license is and where we can manage the land use conflicts, rather than this ad hoc approach where these things are popping up all over New South Wales.
And Matt, I think one thing that I've picked up in my reporting over the years is there's a really big interest in the regions about ways to revitalise manufacturing. There's also, I think, a lot of fair scepticism among the tax-paying public about the relationship between, well, let's be kind and say previous governments and electricity generators as well. What, you know, is it in government's interest? Do you think government is willing, I should say, to look at ideas how to get cheap energy back into the regions with localised generation that might even be off the grid, if you know, to put it as simply as possible? You know, that's touted as one of the great beauties of renewable energy, but we're yet to see you know, plans manifest themselves to date. I mean, is that a focus for you? Do you think it's possible?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's not only the regions that will benefit from our electricity infrastructure roadmap, it will be everyone across New South Wales. With the advent of these new technologies, which includes renewables, we're not only getting clean energy, we're getting damn cheap energy. And that energy backed up with dispatchable technology like batteries, pumped hydro, gas, things like that, in combination with renewables, means that we can get some of the cheapest, most reliable and cleanest energy anywhere in the world. What does that mean for mums and dads? It means lower household bills. I mean, for the last decade, we've seen our bills going up, and our strategy will now see them coming down to some of the cheapest anywhere in the world. Our modelling shows that we can get the third cheapest electricity costs in the world as a result of our electricity infrastructure roadmap. But what it also means is that our businesses, our energy intensive businesses, the big users of electricity across New South Wales, primarily based in the regions, will also get access to not only cheap and reliable electricity, but clean electricity, which means as they're looking to sell their products into international markets, which have committed to net zero emissions, they will still be competitive. I mean, we're already seeing big markets for, you know, our agricultural products, a lot of our exports, starting to look to things like carbon tariffs. If you're producing goods and services not made with a low carbon footprint, you won't be able to sell in those markets. That will come at the expense of Australian jobs. That will come at the expense of Australian investment. So our renewable energy strategy, our electricity infrastructure roadmap, is not just about delivering cheap energy. It's about ensuring that our farmers, our businesses that are based in the regions, our energy intensive businesses, are going to have a competitive advantage. That will mean investments coming back on shore, industries coming back on shore, manufacturing's coming back on shore, jobs are being created here. And we're setting ourselves up to win in that new world, which is coming. It doesn't matter how much Alan Jones shouts at the TV at Sky After Dark. The reality is that today, 50% of the world's GDP has committed to net zero emissions. And in order to get there, they're not going to outsource those jobs to those countries that are heavy polluting and heavy carbon emitting. They're going to be looking for low carbon sources of goods and services. We're really well placed to provide it because of this electricity infrastructure roadmap. And just to your point, Mike, and sorry, that's a bit of a rambling answer, by getting low cost electricity into the regions, I mean, we're going to see a renaissance for rural and regional New South Wales. This is 12 gigawatts of energy generation that we've got to build in the next decade, in addition to the transmission lines and other infrastructure to support it. That's investment. That's $32 billion worth of investment going to 5 regions in New South Wales. That is going to revitalise the bush. And the rising tide lifts all boats. So those communities will be enormous beneficiaries of what is going to set us up for a very bright, prosperous future.
And to be specific about that, Matt, is there an opportunity in your mind for manufacturing to draw directly from the source, you know, sort of to cut out the networks, as it were? Because I think that is viewed as a very exciting prospect for manufacturing located near the source of generation. You don't need the cost of transmission lines, which are hugely expensive, as you know, and then back it up with battery power. Is that something that you're, you know, actively investigating?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the closer you can build to the source of generation, the cheaper your bill's going to be. I mean, we know that our energy infrastructure roadmap is going to deliver some of the cheapest wholesale prices anywhere in the world. But then you've got to factor in the transmission costs or the network costs, as your viewers would know them as. So the closer you can build, so closer users can get to the source of generation, the cheaper their bill's going to be. Which means, again, because all this generation is being built in the bush, there's a huge opportunity for industry to relocate close to those sources of generation because, again, they'll have a competitive advantage, particularly in those energy-intensive industries. So that means investment, jobs, and opportunity going to rural and regional New South Wales. I mean, this is going to be a renaissance for the bush like we've never seen before. And again, this has got nothing to do with climate change, everything to do with economics. And I'm trying to focus on setting us up for a bright, prosperous and stronger future.
And well, that's a neat segue for us. I'd really like to get into New South Wales plans and where you see net zero policy, the policies to facilitate the transition outside of the energy sector to net zero. I know New South Wales has put a pot of cash together for some of that transition work, haven't you, with 700 million on the table initially in assistance for industry. What work have you been doing there, and where do your priorities lie at the start of the journey in terms of working with agriculture to reduce emissions? What are the what are the priority areas for you?
Well, the first thing I'd say is that Australia and New South Wales in particular have enormous opportunities to grow our economy as the world decarbonises. I mean, we've got some of the best renewable resources anywhere in the world. And as the world decarbonises, we're not just a sunburnt country, we're a sun-blessed country. Our renewable energy resources can underwrite new industries in green hydrogen and materials like green steel and aluminium, which the world is going to need to meet their decarbonisation objectives. So it's going to be really hard to export those cleaner forms of energy. So I know Mike Cannon-Brooks and Twiggy Forrest are trying to do it by building a massive solar farm in the middle of the desert. They're going to build a cable up to Singapore to provide around 30% of their electricity. But that's a huge exercise. Just like hydrogen, that can only be produced, or the cheap hydrogen can only be produced where you've got an abundance of renewables. So it rules out a whole range of countries that don't have the available land to host the renewables and don't have the natural resources. So that means, again, New South Wales and indeed Australia is going to have a huge competitive advantage, but it's going to be really costly to export and transport that hydrogen, which means that you'll have to be creating those products that like steel and aluminium in countries that do have access to a lot of renewables at a cheap price. So that gives us a huge competitive advantage, particularly in the regions. But, it's not, so I guess in summary that as the world moves to decarbonise, our low-cost clean electricity can be the foundation for our industry to win the 24th century. And as I was saying, it's not just a renewable energy story, it's a story about the transformation of our entire economy. And take, for example, agriculture. It represents about 20% of our state's emissions. You can reduce livestock emissions, for example, by providing a seaweed supplement to the food we give our animals. And that supplement can reduce livestock emissions by about 90%, whilst at the same time increasing the speed at which our animals grow. We know that sequestering carbon in our soil is not only good for the atmosphere, but also to ensure that our soils hold more moisture and become more productive over time. That's one of the reasons that Meat Livestock Australia has got a 30% or got a 100% net zero target by 2030. Decarbonising is going to require Australian agriculture. It's going to require Australian iron ore, copper, nickel, and lithium. So it means that there are huge opportunities in the mining sector. So we're trying to focus on areas where we can reduce our carbon footprint, but grow sectors of the economy, rather than putting in place taxes and regulations to punish sectors of the economy. And that's, I guess, the difference between our approach and what has been tried previously.
And I know in this area of, you mentioned soil carbon sequestration and, schemes to incentivise agriculture to reduce emissions. I know that there is quite a lot of federal overlay, and it's quite confusing to know where state jurisdiction ends and the feds take over. Having said that, it would be really instructive to know, Minister, what your thoughts are on what role the state can play there, because it's so close we can grasp it, isn't it? The opportunities that are starting to develop, those new markets for carbon, or even for biodiversity, to grow biodiversity on farm. So I know it's a broad question, but it'd be really important to drill down into it. If you can let us know what your thoughts are, what role the state can play in sort of facilitating access to those markets for our farmers.
Well, I guess, in order to position New South Wales well for the future, we're looking at ways to support the reduction of emissions from agriculture and ensure that New South Wales farmers can be rewarded for enhanced environmental performance through market access or through realising price premiums, for example. We've just set up a primary industries productivity and abatement program as part of our net zero plan here in New South Wales. That program's focused on reducing direct emissions from agriculture. So, for example, from livestock, and increasing sequestration in soils and vegetation, including coastal zones. That program is currently being developed in collaboration with the New South Wales Department of Primary Industries, where Adam Marshall and I are working closely on this. But we're particularly keen to support the implementation of projects and practices that deliver carbon abatement alongside economic, environmental, and social and cultural benefits. So, for example, soil carbon projects that can improve on-farm productivity and drought resilience alongside revegetation projects on Aboriginal managed lands can deliver carbon, biodiversity and community development outcomes. So we're looking for opportunities to have win-win projects. What I'm focused on is exploring ways to support farmers being rewarded for delivering environmental outcomes. So, for example, through improving access to New South Wales farmers to carbon markets and identifying ways for farmers to access both carbon and biodiversity payments that are commensurate with the development of land. So we need to value our natural capital. We need to put a good value on our natural capital so farmers can be rewarded for helping us meet not only our carbon objectives, but also our biodiversity objectives. And that's the kind of policy space that I'm thinking about.
So how much easier, to ask the cheeky question, how much easier does your job become if a federal government sets a nationwide emissions reduction target?
Oh, look, I mean, again, that's one mechanism that can be used to achieve our policy objectives. But there are a number, and I'm not going to, sit here waiting for the federal government to put in place their policy objectives. I want to get on with it so I can make sure that New South Wales farmers are ahead of the curve in a world that is rapidly changing, that they're ready and well placed to benefit from these enormous global megatrends that are outside our control. I mean, Barnaby and Matt Canavan can yell and scream all they want. The reality is the world's moving. Let's get ahead of the curve to ensure that we're not left behind, but rather we're ready to prosper. That's what I'm trying to do.
How does the potential for Santos to expand its Narrabri gas field fit into those, into that sunny future world where agriculture is achieving added value for all its exports, Australia's clean and green image, and yet, it's potentially those petroleum exploration licenses, they haven't been knocked off on the Liverpool plains yet. It's a hugely controversial issue. I'm just wondering how that can be sustained, Minister, as a viable policy in the future that you're mapping out for us here.
Well, I think that my job is to ensure that we keep the lights on, drive electricity prices down, and support our industry in a very quickly changing world. Now, we know that coal electricity generation here in New South Wales has probably a bit of a timeline on it, and largely due to the fact that the old technology that has been providing our electricity has been superseded by newer technology that's just as reliable and also happens to be cheaper and cleaner. So in order to transition, we need to make sure that we do so in an orderly fashion. And right now, a lot of the long duration storage, like pumped hydro dams and batteries, they're still, at a price in the cost curve that's a bit high. So the natural transition fuel is gas. Now, we know that in 2023, there's going to be a huge gas shortage. The Narrabri project is going to be important in helping us meet our gas needs. That said, it's not the only solution. We've got an import terminal that we've approved. But certainly for the long-term future for New South Wales to compete in a low carbon global environment, for our businesses to be able to compete, for our families to be able to get cheap electricity, cheap energy sources. Gas is probably not, I'm hoping that there'll be other forms of more economically viable energy sources like hydrogen, for example, but we're still a fair way off that.
Okay, it's a question about, we've been talking about future renewables development, and you're focused on community consultation and social license, and it's quite a confusing message for many. I would have thought that there's local community opposition to development on the Liverpool Plains and broad questions across New South Wales as well. It is some of the best agricultural land in the world. I'm just wondering if you think that it is potential for, Narrabri can apply, like the Santos can apply to expand their project there now, and then it's up to the government to approve or disapprove. Is there any potential that the government could approve that development?
So my view has always been that where there is no risk to the environment, no risk to human health, and no risk to our water table, and effectively those that use the water that could be impacted, then why wouldn't we allow it to go ahead and let the market decide? There has been a rigorous assessment of the licenses around the CSG project in Narrabri. That's gone through a thorough process. I'm happy that based on the scientific advice that has been given to me, that it can meet those three criteria that I talked about: human health impacts, environmental impacts, and water impacts, and that the right protections can be put in place to mitigate them. So I'm happy if the market wants to go ahead with that project, good luck to them. But at the same time, the government is pursuing the development of new sources of cheaper, cleaner, and more reliable electricity sources, and that's what I'm focused on.
And just to be clear, I hope I wasn't confusing there, but I am referring specifically to expansion beyond the Pilliga forest as well, into potentially into farmland outside the state, the Crown land in the state forest there. But
look, I don't think there's any appetite for that at this stage. I mean, there's been a planning approval granted. I haven't seen yet any applications to expand that. And I don't think it's helpful to engage in hypotheticals. And right now, the cost to develop that Narrabri, the ones that have been approved, will be in order of $1 billion. The gas price would suggest that that might not be. There might be some problems for Santos going ahead with that, but that's a matter for them. If they want to take that risk, good luck to them. But they do so knowing that there are changes afoot because of these global megatrends, and that the New South Wales government has put in place policies to deliver families and businesses cheaper, cleaner, and more reliable forms of energy.
And moving on to one thing I'm really fascinated by is we touched on it before, but markets for natural capital, and as Environment Minister, and if you think that state planning regulations for development offsets, and if the state can facilitate any sort of markets for farmers to participate in offsetting, like how can you grow that? Where do you see growth potential there? Is it already at capacity?
No, I mean, in order to meet our net zero targets, the world to meet its net zero targets, we're going to need to offset a lot of our carbon. There's a lot of stuff that we just won't be able to abate. So that means that we're going to be needing to protect our biodiversity. The best way to do that is to value it. So I want to set up a scheme that New South Wales farmers can access to either replant parts of their land, to protect existing parts of their land, and be financially compensated for it. I'm not looking to, I don't think we should be putting in place policies that punish farmers. I think we should be putting in place policies that will reward them for helping us meet our objectives as a state and as a nation, and that's what we're focused on. So I think there's huge room for expansion of the BCT. I think there's huge room for expansion to create carbon credits which can be purchased from farmers who are helping us meet our biodiversity objectives. But we need to get the governance around that right. We need to put in place the structures and the systems and processes to be able to measure the carbon that's abated. That's something we're working on at the moment through our primary industries abatement program in partnership with DPI.
Okay, and staying in the environment portfolio there, Matt, in terms of national parks, the state does need to be a good neighbour. How do you see, can the government improve relations with its neighbours in terms of pest and weed management? And also, well, let's stick to that. I mean, I'm also interested in bushfire regulations, but do you have any moves afoot to up your game on reducing invasive animals coming out of national parks, impacting agricultural productivity, or also weed management?
Yeah, look, I hear this concern a lot, and I get it very much. National parks aren't there just for greenies and parkies. They should be there for everyone, and that means they need to be good neighbours. We've just invested heavily in ensuring that we're good neighbours when it comes to fire management. I mean, we've seen what happens when we don't do our bit, and fire that starts on park ends up damaging private property. That's not acceptable. So we've just increased the number of firefighters in our national parks by 130. We've just put significant millions of dollars into ensuring that we're able to better manage fire on park. And we're doing a lot more hazard reduction, which I'm sure some of your members on this call would see. In addition to that, we're rolling out, investing more in fencing programs, for example. And there are programs available to ensure that farmers can get access to funds from national parks to build fences that will stop those feral pests going onto their private land and destroying their crops and livestock. In addition to that, we are undertaking a huge feral pest control management program. We've made the biggest investment in feral pest management in the history of parks. Some of you will be seeing that rolled out in the regions and in our parks in the cities, baiting programs, shooting programs, to ensure that we meet that objective of being good neighbours. But for too long, national parks has been the plaything of greenies and conservationists. And, that's great. But they also need to be good neighbours, and they need to be something that everyone can access and enjoy. And that's why we're investing heavily in building visitor infrastructure. We're spending $130 million to build new walking trails and camping grounds and mountain bike tracks to improve the visitor experience for parks. Parks should be open to everyone to enjoy. They're a great asset. They're also helping us meet some of our carbon objectives. We've just expanded our national park estate in New South Wales by around 400,000 hectares. It's not only protecting our biodiversity in perpetuity, but helping us to offset carbon, to be doing replanting, regeneration, which will be important in terms of gathering those carbon credits that are coming out of Europe, which we're monetarising at the moment.
I guess from a farmer's perspective, Matt, when we hear 400,000 hectare expansion of the national park estate, the question would be, have you increased resources, physical resources, in terms of rangers and park managers to keep on top of, deer are marching across the state, lots of different regions. They're a huge impact, just for one, also weeds in the wake of bushfires as well. Can we expect to see a commensurate uptick in investment in management as well, or what are you doing in that space going forward?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as I said, we've just expanded the size of the national parks labour force to help with the management and the upkeep of these parks, not just in bushfire management, but in feral pest control and weed control. So we're not only expanding our national parks, we're also making sure that we're expanding the workforce to be able to manage them better, be better neighbours, and deliver a better visitor experience for people right across the state.
And what's your position on, I mean, there's been multiple bushfire inquiries, state and federal, and they've all recommended some form of regulation to permit clearing of fire breaks near property and residents as well. I mean, do you have a view on that yet? When can we see a government, response to those recommendations?
So the government has adopted the majority of the recommendations from the bushfire inquiry, the O'Kane inquiry with Dave Owens. One of the recommendations was about giving landowners the ability to clear land, particularly around fire breaks. Now, obviously, there were some concerns from me and my department around the impact that could have on, threatened and endangered species and things like that. But I think we've come up with a pretty good policy which does empower landowners to protect their properties, whilst at the same time ensuring that we also protect and manage some of our most endangered and threatened native species. So that has been finalised. It is out on public exhibition, that program, but it will ensure that next fire season, people will be able to take responsibility for protecting their own property by creating fire breaks.
And Matt, in terms of, like segueing neatly on from there, farmers' ability to sort of control management of their land, the decision by the Threatened Species Scientific Committee to that declared white box, yellow box, Blakey's red gum, grassy woodland as critically endangered, it's got some big statewide ramifications, doesn't it? And there's a lot of impacts from that. But I'm just wondering from your point of view, and also how does that decision gel from an independent committee have made that decision, but the government's responsible for the triple bottom line as well, and managing social, environmental, yes, but also economic outcomes. It seems like that there isn't much room to move for farmers, even if it's not a viable ecological community on a piece of private land. It's contained by agricultural land surrounding it, and yet it's still critically endangered and severely inhibits agricultural development. I mean, is that up for review, that decision-making process, or that determination itself? Is there room to move on that?
Well, I think we always need to be listening to the science and making decisions based on the best evidence that we have available to us. And that's why we have an independent threatened species committee. But at the end of the day, the elected representatives, the government, the minister, we're accountable for the policy decisions. Now, my view is that we should be making decisions based on the best evidence and the best science, but we also need to make sure that it's grounded with evidence from local communities and the users of that information. And that's why we need to make sure that we come up with policies that balance the needs of private property owners with the evidence that we have available. And that's what we've done. We've done it when it came to the yellow box. We've done it when it came to a number of recommendations from that committee. Do we always get it right? Could we do better? Absolutely. But, we're not going to be some kind of Trumpian government that just rips up evidence and scientific advice. We're going to work with those people and come up with the best suite of policies that will get the balance right between private property owners and our environment.
So, would it be fair to say that you'd encourage New South Wales farmers to keep lobbying on that issue? There's a potential policy change in response if they can make their case?
We've got a very strong relationship with New South Wales farmers. As I said, Pete Arkell is a very trusted stakeholder with my office and my team. We engage very closely with him on all matters affecting the New South Wales farming community. In fact, he's one of the first points of call that we make. So we'll continue to work closely with him and Minister Marshall and Minister Barilaro to make sure that we get the best policy outcomes to deliver wins for farmers, wins for the environment, and a good outcome for everyone.
And Matt, in terms of outcomes as well, there's I've heard it anecdotally. Questions are coming through on potential perverse outcomes from the koala planning laws. And by perverse outcomes, I mean that there is a reluctance among some landholders to put their hand up and notify government officials, basically, that the presence of koalas on their land due to the fear of onerous red tape and regulations and negative outcomes there. How can government overcome that? I mean, do you need to relook? I know it's been a process, but does government need to relook at that policy as well, or how do you tackle those perverse outcomes and that reluctance?
Well, I think it's a great challenge, as you saw last year, the pressure that it put on the New South Wales government in trying to find the right balance, and it is a great challenge. But what we do know, and as the Environment Minister, our koala populations are massively under threat. It's one of our most loved and iconic animals. I haven't met a farmer yet that doesn't want to protect our koalas, but we need to find innovative ways to incentivise our farmers to protect our biodiversity and our natural capital. And that's exactly why we're working on things like expanding the Biodiversity Conservation Trust so that we can encourage private landowners or reward private landowners to protect core koala habitat. Obviously, there is a need for some regulatory levers, but I prefer a lighter touch with more incentives than the other way around.
So in terms of lighter touch and more incentives, does that feed back into, I mean, can state government contribute to payments for natural capital, I guess is what I'm getting at. I mean, can state government help, create the market that's big enough to really drive outcomes there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's why I put $350 million aside in the BCT that will be spent over the next 5 years to compensate farmers to help us protect core koala habitat. I've just appointed Niall Blair to chair the BCT, and part of his brief is focusing on the BCT payments to those farmers that want to protect and preserve core koala habitat on their properties. So we are very focused on this. There's a lot more to do. You're going to need more than $350 million, though, to be able to protect all our core koala habitat. But we've got the biggest program in valuing natural capital anywhere in the country, and it's thanks to a coalition government that understands that private property rights are critically important, but we also want to try and get the balance right when it comes to protecting our environment. So this is an innovative policy. It's world leading. It's certainly nation leading, and I'm looking to find new ways to encourage farmers and reward farmers for protecting their biodiversity.
Yeah, so in that, you'd see a role for private investment to bolster that as well over time, and participate in those carbon offset markets, biodiversity offset markets as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're seeing these emerging markets very quickly, particularly out of Europe and North America. I want to make sure that we've got systems and processes in place here in New South Wales so that farmers can start trading those commodities that deliver that win-win, as I said, that protecting our environment and also rewarding our farmers financially. I mean, I don't want to see farmers penalised for doing the right thing. I want to see them rewarded and compensated very well. There shouldn't be a choice between clearing our important koala habitat and developing land. There should be a financial mechanism that rewards people and compensates. It's more attractive to protect core koala habitat on land than to clear it. That's what we're working towards.
Yeah, I see. But in terms of like creating funds that private investment can tip into, I guess, just because, and the reason I'm harping on about that is it's something that can be tangible and for farmers to sort of help improve management of land and also improve the economic output from their agricultural land as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this comes back to this topic of valuing natural capital. There are markets already emerging, and I want to make sure that we can take full advantage of those opportunities.
Yeah, I see. Well, I think we're up to the point. Am I getting a signal that I need to throw back to James Jackson there, or? No, I think we do. I think we do have time for a couple more. If we could get down to, I know it's not specifically your portfolio there, but in terms of water, like coastal harvestable rights on water, Matt, and if you've got an opinion there, we've got quite a few questions coming through on that. I mean, would you support an increase, a 10% increase in those coastal harvestable water rights?
I'm definitely straying well outside my portfolio area, so I wouldn't want to get caught up in something that I'm not completely across. But what I will say is that we know when it comes to managing the Murray-Darling Basin, for example, that our environment is changing, and that's going to change the amount of water available and when it's available. So we need to make sure that our sharing plans and the way we manage the Murray-Darling Basin reflects that reality, and that's what we're trying to do. So where that extends to the coastal rights, we need to make sure that the water sharing plans, the management of our rivers, inland and otherwise, reflects the reality and the environment that we're operating in today.
And in terms, like, climate change is going to put increasing pressure on on the natural estate, isn't it? And I'm just wondering, in terms of the environment portfolio again, and protecting those natural assets, there's so much biodiversity and native flora and fauna that benefits from good management of private land as well. And this goes back to your valuing natural capital, but to ask it in the negative way, there's going to be a need to, I mean, is there a need for government to intervene to stop those assets being degraded? Because private landholders, how do they manage to carry the costs that are, you know, in their remnant bushland on their land that isn't generating a profit for them? I mean, it is a bit of a philosophical question, Matt, but do you see a role for government there as well? I mean, how do you create a market for that as well?
Well, I mean, this is a really important topic. I mean, we can either put in place tougher regulations or we can create incentives. Now, you know, I'm a member of the coalition, and my incentive, my preference is always to reward and incentivize people to do the right thing rather than put in place a big stick approach. So that's what we're trying to do here in New South Wales. Certainly I, as the Environment Minister, is approaching the challenges that we face with that mindset. And we want to work with landowners that want to, become more productive. They want to protect their natural capital and want to be compensated for it. So very keen to continue to work with New South Wales farmers to find solutions to these problems.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Matt. I really appreciate taking all those questions. I'm getting the wrap up, and I think we've got James Jackson on the line now that can round off for us.
Thanks, Mike.
Yes, Matt. Yes, thank you very much for fronting up tonight for this forum. It is actually a very important portfolio that certainly affects agriculture across New South Wales, and we do actually appreciate the access that we've got to your office. So certainly appreciate that. Your insights tonight have been very revealing, and I certainly like a couple of the things that you've said. That incentivise biodiversity. I prefer the lighter touch and more incentives, very much like that. I don't want to see farmers punished for doing the right thing. Very much I like that. We actually see, that $30 billion target, there's about $1.5 billion of that, or about 5%. By 2030, we're looking at that being, eco-services payments, carbon and biodiversity payments. So there's a fair way to go on that, and there's a fair few fences to mend, if you like, on that as well, because a lot of those things, that regulatory touch has been, has been very harsh, if you like. That statutory theft of all our biodiversity credits and, our native vegetation and carbon up to date. I mean, it really has been, we've donated it to the cause, very much unwillingly, but it is good to hear you with that conciliatory type approach, and I certainly appreciate that. I'd like to thank Mike Foley and everybody for tuning in tonight, and listening to it, because I think we all learned a little bit about where the government is heading on some of these topics. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister.
Thanks, James, for having me.
Thank you, Minister, and thank you, members, for your attendance tonight. That concludes our webinar. We hope you've taken some value away from tonight, and we look forward to seeing you at one of our next 30 by 30 webinars. Please stay tuned to your farm post, or consider joining as a New South Wales Farmers member to keep up to date with all of our information. Once again, thank you and have a lovely evening.